afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome. This is the Duchin Campus Lecture Series in Judaic Studies, made possible by the generosity of Sally Duchin and her late husband of blessed memory, Ralph Duchin. I'm David Graysboard, and I form part of the faculty here at the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies of the University of Arizona. Before I introduce today's speaker, I wanted to let you know that on February the 8th, that's a Tuesday, the Duchin series will resume with a conversation with Izabela Tabarovsky, a researcher from the Wilson Center in DC. She will be speaking about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in contemporary politics as possibly historical cousins, as she put it. So details on that talk will be forthcoming via various media. Stay tuned. Now, today, I'm very pleased to introduce to you our speaker, our guest speaker, Anna Hájková. Dr. Hájková is associate professor at the University of Warwick in the UK. She's joining us now from the UK, where it is, I believe, 10 p.m. So thank you for the, or 11, is it? I don't remember. Anyway, it's a very different time zone, which goes to show that we scholars, we literally lose sleep over what we do. But I digress. This afternoon, Professor Hájková will be discussing her book, The Last Ghetto, An Everyday History of Theresienstadt. That book came out in 2020 with the Oxford University Press. Professor Hájková's work has been published variously in Czech, German, British, US, American, and Israeli newspapers. Among other things, she guest edited a special issue of the journal, the professional journal, German History, on the subject of Holocaust, sexuality, and stigma. She also won a prestigious award for her 2013 article, Sexual Barter in Times of Genocide. Currently, Professor Hájková is working on two major research and writing projects. The first is a study on non-normative sexuality and culture during the Shoah. Specifically, it explores a coerced relationship between a guard and a Jewish prisoner. The second project is a generational history of communists in Central Europe from 1930 to 1970. So I thank Professor Hájková for joining us today. And I also want to thank, of course, our fearless staff, Jackie Schmidt, for making all the logistical details possible, and Martha Castleberry for working out all the business arrangements. Of course, I also want to thank you, our Zoom audience, without whom none of this would be possible or particularly worthwhile. So in the next 45 minutes or so, Professor Hájková will give us a brief presentation, and then she and I will discuss aspects of her book and its contributions. And then in the last 15 minutes or so, I will open this up to your questions. So please type your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom window. That's on the lower right-hand side of your screen. Keep your questions concise, if you please would, so that we can accommodate as many as possible. Okay, so with that said, let me again thank you, Anna Hájková, and give you the proscenium.
Thank you so much, David, for the kind and generous introduction and invite. And thank you to Jackie Schmidt for the organization. And I will start sharing my screen. Here we go. And in the following something like 8 to 10 minutes, I want to share with you a couple of insights about my book in Jewish history. But first, a little bit about the book. I wrote it so that it does two things. It offers a new history of Terezinstadt that is modern and analytical by someone, as you see, who did not survive Terezinstadt. So far, most of the histories that are well known to date have been written by survivors. But moreover, I have also written the book as a kind of classical so what academical study for people who specifically are not interested in Terezinstadt, as an analytical history of a camp society, of coerced society in the Holocaust, but also beyond. One of the chief aims of my book aims to go beyond the exceptionalist paradigm of the Holocaust that only interprets the Holocaust out of the perception of the Holocaust and puts it into wider general histories. In the following few minutes, I want to introduce you to some of the key themes of the book, specifically two, that I hope are relevant for wider Jewish history. One, transnational history, and 2, assimilation. There are more, but time is limited. But before I do that, a little bit on a short history of the ghetto. Many of you will have visited the Czech Republic and Terezín, as Terezinstadt is called in Czech, and it's a fortress town that survived pretty much as it was in the 1940s as it is today. As a fortress town, when in 1941 the Nazis were looking for a transit ghetto where to keep all of the Czech Jews, they very quickly came across Terezinstadt because it was relatively easy to be guarded. And almost all of the Czech Jews were deported here, and later on also exception groups from Central and Western Europe. From the beginning on, Terezinstadt had the Jewish self-administration, the heavy work of administering the ghetto. The Nazis were all too keen to outsource to the Jews. So the Germans controlled the ghetto, but did not administrate it. It meant, among others, that when transports were leaving to the east, it was the Jewish task to put the actual names on the transport list. And the guarding was done by Czech gendarmes. One of the things that I did for the book is to also have new maps drawn, because it's quite important to understand any of these N4 sites in terms of spatial history. And because my wife is architect, she drew the maps. And one of the 2 or 3 things that Terezinstadt is best known for are the propaganda aspects, the visit of International Red Cross in June 1944, and also the propaganda movie that was not called Hitler Gives the Jews a City, but rather it was called Theresienstadt, a documentary film from Jewish settlement area. These aspects are kind of known from the outside, but as I show in the book, for the everyday experience of the prisoners, they had actually very little impact. The other thing that is well known about Terezinstadt is what I call the mass narrative, the story that emerged already in Terezinstadt, that the ghetto was a site where Jews, persecuted, banished from their homes and marked as pariahs, proved that they could salvage something good out of something bad. This Terezin mass narrative maintained that the prisoners could excel at manual labor, take care of the most vulnerable, whom they defined as children, and produce outstanding, moving, and beautiful cultural events. And this master narrative, which is not wrong, it's just part of the story that happened in Terezinstadt, in turn produced corresponding memories. And what I do in my book is that I put the many, many experiences and many, many testimonies, diaries, drawings, letters, all histories, publish autobiographies, court proceedings, and so on together, and show multi-perspectively what it meant to be in Terezinstadt. And now I want to jump on the first point, namely on transnational history. I've already touched before on my critique of the Holocaust exceptional paradigm, and that is a bigger, not only Jewish or Holocaust studies tendency to see Holocaust as a history apart, one that is terribly interesting, but also a history that, because it's so horrible, somehow doesn't speak to the bigger European or global framework. That is a problem because it is a genocide that very much happened in the 20th century where it took place. But then when you look within the Holocaust, these are often histories written as national histories. As a Polish history, say Auschwitz or the Warsaw Ghetto, or as a German history, that of the perpetrators, or as somebody who was born in Czechoslovakia, as a Czech history or as a Zionist history. And these understandable takes, and I'm the first one to understand it because they are motivated by the place where people grow up, by their linguistic skills. And also very importantly, the audience that you write to are unfortunately a little bit reductive for our understanding of the prisoner societies in many ghettos, not all, and most of the concentration camps. Terezinstadt, and now I want to backtrack to the bit I quickly said about Central and Western European Jews who were deported here, specifically all of the Czech Jews and then exception groups from Germany, Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands, Slovakia, and Hungary, either Jews or people who were marked by the Nazis as such. And as I show in my book, the Nazi imprisonment brought about a very differentiated, nuanced, and heterogeneous prisoner society. And what may appear to us today as small differences, whether you lived in a room together with 4 other people, or whether you had a tiny room of your own, whether you had small food rations of the so-called full laborers or the K portions for the so-called sick people, that could be difference between life and death or much better conditions in Theresienstadt. Other differentiation in Theresienstadt is also the age. Majority of the people deported from Germany and Austria were the elderly, and the totality of the Czech Jews who were deported here, if they did not manage to emigrate, meant that almost all of the young people who were imprisoned in Theresienstadt were Czech Jews. Czech Jews also arrived by 6 months as the first, and that put them in a power position as people who were younger and as people with seniority. And in terms of transnational history, we need to take these vastly different experiences of people with different ethnic backgrounds, with people of different age, and with people with different habitus to understand how the prisoner society came to be, but also how it became merging and becoming really a society. Because these are not people living apart. These are groups that are connected, they communicate, and that start changing. I want to give you a couple of short examples. My very favorite, Rolf Grabo, who was before the war a high-ranking Protestant Jewish civil servant in the German Ministry of Finances. He is seen as one of the forefathers of the valued edit tax, was deported to Terezinstadt in 1942. He saw himself as a Protestant, even though he was of Jewish background. And even though he was a so-called baptized Jew, and he did not see himself as Jewish, and even though the first Zionist leadership of Terezinstadt looked at people like Grabo really with dislike, Grabo, even though he was 60 years of age and did not speak like almost any of the German Jews a word of Czech, he made a career in Terezinstadt, and 2 years after he has been expelled here by the Nazis, he was working among the upper echelons of the Jewish self-administration. That also meant that he was present and working with the Jewish self-administration when the Nazis sent 7,500 people in May 1944 to Auschwitz. And the horrible bureaucratic burden to choose who will go on the transport list and how to organize these transports as humanly as possible came to the Jewish self-administration. These were often very stressful situations, and the Jewish functionaries worked nonstop day and night. Grabo complained in his notes about the lack of tact of his Czech colleagues, who sometimes, when they would be very stressed, stopped speaking German and switched into Czech that he could not understand. He complained to his colleague and the deputy elder Otto Zucker, a Czech Jewish architect, who then became one of the functionaries. And Zucker comforted him with the words, "Just wait, Grabo, in a few months you too will pick up Czech." And in a way, this is just a charming story, but it shows you this changing society in which an elderly German civil servant is actually expected to learn Czech, this kind of otherwise very small and difficult language, to become a part of this new melting pot in which the power positions between a small language like Czech and big language like German have changed. The other example that I want to show with you is in the depths of January, that is very cold here in England, is something that I found very moving when I came across it at a copy of the poem, "The Spring Shall Come," that I found in the papers of Leo Säbel, who as a teenager emigrated from his native Leipzig in Saxony, Germany, on the youth aliyah to Denmark, and then was among the few hundred of Danish Jews who were deported to Terezinstadt. He made friends among the other Czech Zionists, and he also copied down phonetically the poem "Přijde jaro přijde, the spring shall come." It was in fact part of the performance of Jan Karafiát's Fireflies, a children's opera and dance by Nava Šönova, by Vlasta Šönova. And reading it, I realized how incredibly emotional this must have been to the Czech Jews, and how Leo Säbel copied it down because it was so important to his friends. And again, rather than just an anecdote, this little poem that was kept among his papers would be completely illegible to people from the outside if we do not take transnational history, and something that was quite short-lived, but speaks very poignantly to the nature of this enforced transnational society that emerged here, that otherwise we will not be able to grasp how it worked or the lived experience of the people who were forced to live here. Now on the second point, and assimilation. Many of you will be familiar and maybe a little bit even uncomfortable with me using the term assimilation, because in German Jewish history and in Central European Jewish history, but also in American studies, there has been a much debate, a necessary debate about the nature of this word. Is it not normative? And my understanding of what I have studied in Theresienstadt is that for Central European Jews, we in fact need to take assimilation on board. The term acculturation is simply not going to cut it, because if we understand the people in Theresienstadt and how close they were to the communities that they had considered home, it really implies that assimilation is here the stronger term and needs to be taken seriously. There was a Catholic community in Theresienstadt, and thanks to them, we know that in addition to the observant Jews, both Orthodox and Reform, in Theresienstadt among the prisoners were many atheists, a large Catholic and Protestant group, and in fact also 12 Adventists, 4 Christian Scientists, and 3 Muslims. And by the way, all of these people are racially Jewish, but the religion they follow, and if they follow any religion, is then different. And when we look at the contemporaneous self-testimonies of Czech Jews, they continue talking over and over about the relations to home. And I want to share with you just this one image, a cover of Monaco, one of the journals of the youth homes, for, in this case, for teenage girls who were so-called Geltungsjuden, who were one of their parents was Gentile, and therefore they were deported to Terezinstadt without their parents, because mixed marriages were kept in Prague almost until the end of the war. And you see here a sign showing do Prahy, to Prague. That is the one thing that they thought about. Now you could say these are mixed teenagers, where one of the parents is non-Jewish, but you find the similar motive with many, many others, even with Czech Zionists. There were many evocations of all sorts of Czech rituals and symbols. For instance, several inmates cut little wood lions, which were very popular, as the double-tailed lion is the Czech coat of arms. And one more drawing that I want to share is this watercolor by Lotra Borishova, who drew a watercolor for her friend and colleague, the frame maker František Franz Feigl. And she drew here a girl jumping through a frame. And it's a very pretty girl, but it's worth kind of looking at how her attractiveness is expressed. First, it's by the Czech national colors of blue, red, and white, but then also that she's partially disrobed. You can see her cleavage and you can see her leg. And one of the things that I kind of try to discuss, and I am doing here only very briefly, is how we understand femininity, how we understand gender, and how we understand beauty is incredibly coded in the culture, or if you want me to speak a little bit sociologically, in the habitus of people come from. When I show this drawing to my Czech friends or relatives, they find her beautiful. When I show it to my non-Czech friends and colleagues, they find her also beautiful, but they first and foremost find her a little bit strange and a little bit naked. That is to be understood with how we frame a beauty and meaning. At the first Christmas in Terezin in 1941, people read out of the Bible of Kralice, the 16th century translation by Bohemian Brethren that is coded by being particularly anti-Habsburg and pro-Masaryk, that is pro-independent Czechoslovakia. Reading the Bible of Kralice in the ghetto, where everybody was deported because they were marked as Jewish, placed Terezinstadt in the context of the Czech national struggle of the 19th century, struggling for independent Czechoslovakia against the Habsburgs. Most Czech Jews in Terezin celebrated Christmas, Easter, and St. Nicholas Day, not necessarily because it was coded in a Christian way, but because it was something that kind of coded you culturally to the circles to which you belonged. And we even have stories about Czech Jewish children in Terezin walking around on St. Nicholas Day dressed, and this is kind of a habit that you can see in the Czech Republic until today on 5th of December, the eve of St. Nicholas, dressed in St. Nicholas, and the Star of David, they did not have on their costumes, but on the Nicholas hat. And these holidays, such Christmas and Easter and so on, played a much more emotional role than Passover and Yom Kippur, even though these were observed too, but the emotional hefted meaning of these holidays was a different one. What I was struck by is the anecdotal evidence of the many divorced mixed marriages among the Czech Jews who were deported to Theresienstadt. We do not quite have the hard numbers for all of the people whose marriages fell apart after the occupation by the Nazis, but the high anecdotal evidence shows that mixed marriage that has been traditional, and I think with a good reason to taken as a sign and symbol for assimilation, was extremely high. And then we have people like Bohumil Benda, the son of the Czech Jewish kosher butcher and charcutier in the Prague city center in Pařížská, this beautiful Art Nouveau street that leads old to the Old Town Square. And Benda called these three children Růžena, Ludmila, and Bohubil. Now you could say about Růžena in German Rose, or in English Rose, that's a translatable first name, but Ludmila and Bohumila only exist in as Czech version, so it's quite a strong marker for this kosher, charcutier, and butcher, how to call his children. But beyond just the layer, Czech Jews were assimilated, or German Jews were assimilated, and these findings confirm the early research by my colleague Tatiana Lichtenstein and others. The other point I want to make about assimilation is the layer how imprisonment strengthened the habitus of the people, the social fabric that expresses commonality in taste, ways of expressing humor, or as I said before, understanding how gender works, or ways of making friends. In the imprisonment, Jews from Germany, Netherlands, or Czechoslovakia found out how much they shared with the place from where they had been expelled, and found that Terezinstadt, in fact, for them confirmed these ties. So the commonality that emerges in Terezinstadt is not necessarily one of Jewishness. It is one of being in Terezinstadt, and this is what the master narrative is so important for, because it cements a commonality that is not specifically Jewish, because Czech Jews arrive in Terezinstadt, and the experience of imprisonment actually makes them feel more keenly about being Czech, and so on and so on. Assimilation plays a role in the discussions of Jewishness. It is rather as a form of othering. For example, German Jews look at the Czech Jews and find them beautiful, but a little bit too assimilated. Or the Czech Jews observe the German Jews, and if they discuss them in terms of Jewishness, then either as too orthodox or too assimilated, always something that is too different. Now, to come to an end, all of this attention to the people and life in Terezinstadt should not distract from the fact that almost every one of these people was murdered. In my book, I wanted to honor and examine the last, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, and sometimes years of their lives, the decisions they made, however limited. And this is why I dedicated the book to those who did not return. This is what I always wanted. Thank you so much. I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to all of this.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Hájková. You raise very interesting points. I'm drawn by your observations about assimilation. With that in mind, let me ad lib a question that we haven't discussed, if you'll permit me. Those scholars who study Central European Jews sometimes make use to Gershom Scholem's observation that the relationship between German Jews and Germany and German culture was a one-sided love affair. To what extent do you think that this was, if any, do you think that this was true in the case of Czech Jews, and other, let's say, Central European or Westernized Jews, you call them assimilated Jews, who were interned in Theresienstadt.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Professor Greisberg. This is an incredibly important point. And in a way, I thought about it a lot. And this concept of love and unrequited love and how useful is it is something that has driven me a lot. And in a way, it's a little bit a quest for justice. And if I just may answer the one bit that you did not touch on, because it's important to me, I really thought we should not only decide the Germanness because these people were expelled out of Germany. They too were German. And it's actually really, really important for them. They still read their Goethe and Faust. They put on Kleist, they discuss Schiller. And it's often the last thing they do. I remember this testimony by a Quaker woman who witnesses the deportation of an 80-year-old Jewish friend who holds a book by Goethe and says, "My Germany they cannot take away from me." Now, of course, this is a bit sentimental, but there are moments that when it's good to be sentimental. And therefore, Scholem is right, but also he is wrong because they were German. Mm-hmm. We should not only leave this honor to the Nazis, who also were German. Right. With the Czech Jews and unrequited love, in a way, it's a little bit similar situation because their love for everything Czechoslovak at Masaryk actually was a really important driving force in creating this master narrative of amazing independent Czechoslovakia. Andrea Ozov published about 15 years ago this book, Struggle for the Castle, about kind of the production of the myth of the Czechoslovak Independent Republic. And it's not with an accident that actually it was the father of Madeleine Albright, Richard Korbel, I'm blanking out on his first name, a Czech Jew who was such a good Czechoslovak Jew that in the immigration, he kind of forgot to tell his children that they were actually Jewish. And he was one of the 10 or 20 foremost upkeepers of this myth. And you see that in Terezinstadt too. If I may just share one story, because my book will come out in Czech in a month or two. And it's something that I foresee with joy, but a little bit of nervosity, because Czech Republic in the last 2 or 3 years started having the overdue debate about the role of the complicity of non-Jewish Czechs. Now, this is not a discussion to which I actually really contribute, but because I tell different stories about Terezinstadt that dare to bring in the transnational history and show how the younger Czech Jews had a relatively seen privileged time, as long as they stay in Terezinstadt, that bubble burst as soon as they arrived at Auschwitz. With that, I scratch on established master narratives. So I think the discussions about the return, about anti-Semitism, about Aryanization, all of those stories are overdue. And then the questions about requited love and Czechoslovak Jews will be answered, and it will be a troubling answer, but it's also an overdue answer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That'll be a very interesting discussion. You know, the injection of a self-consciously transnational approach to a national context, right? To a national discussion. Speaking of that concept which you introduced here, I wanted to raise a question that you know, I had formulated before, but perhaps I can modify it a bit given your earlier presentation. So, I mean, very clearly, you present your approach as pushing against an exceptionalist view of the Holocaust. And then, of course, there is the position that the Holocaust belongs very firmly in Jewish history. Now, I suppose that all of us scholars project ourselves in contradistinction to some other scholars, right? But in your view, is there an ideal approach? Perhaps one, and this is me perhaps wishful thinking a little bit, that doesn't dichotomize, that doesn't place exceptionalism and transnationalism as two irreconcilable positions. Is there a happy medium or a more nuanced way to approach the study of the Holocaust?
Mm-hmm. I will endeavor to answer that. I mean, but when we were discussing the questions, I thought about what you post a lot, because I think I never placed myself as a critique of the Holocaust exceptionalism paradigm, specifically in Jewish history, because it is not a debate that I think still needs to be led intellectually. I understand emotionally why it's important, but I do not think it comes to me. The battle I am fighting, or the hill that I'm willing to die on, is my invite to wider general history to engage with history, with Holocaust history. I find it a bit of a shame that often people teach modern European history or 20th century world, and they don't have a class on the Holocaust. So if they have a class on the Holocaust, they have Primo Levi, who is great, but for everything else, they have new books that were published in the last 5 years. So why not for the Holocaust? Yeah. Because so much that we find out correlates with the pre-war histories and with the post-war histories, ordinary men, how gender works, long term of cultures, continuities of homophobia or a newfound homophobia, sexual violence, and so on. And we know it from 20th century modern Europe, but also global history, that these are incredibly important topics. So for me, the dichotomy would be that sometimes if you do not actually pick up a bone in having it discussed, that way you can bypass it a little bit. Having said that, we miss so much when we approach the Holocaust without having a background in Jewish history. And I see it sometimes from research of comparative genocide studies, that if we actually do not pay attention to the Jewish voices and are able to place the making sense of Hurban, or of diary keeping, of chronicle keeping, of thinking about where they came from in the 18th century, and Haskalah, and getting their voice and fighting against anti-Semitism, and therefore also not taking the news of the annihilation in the East that are trickling in seriously, we do not really understand these people. This is why it's so immensely important to take cultural history, new cultural history seriously, because we all kind of continue on the continuum of the generations before us that have instilled us into being the people we are. And without Jewish history, we are not going to be able to understand that. But at the same time, comparative genocide studies show to us, say, for example, as I show in the chapter on food, how famines work, and how as soon as you have an enforced society, and if even a small shortage of food, it will lead to much bigger misdistribution and famine than is actually, like, economically speaking, necessary. And there it's not helpful to say that Amartya Sen has written about India, and we are looking at a Jewish society. These are people, and misdistribution is going to play out the same way. If I may share one more thing, I don't know how it was in Arizona in spring 2020, but in England, we very quickly had shortages. Now, nobody was starving, but there was no flour to be had until well in June 2020. And this is actually a really, really banal example, because we all survived without, having white flour. But it was a good explanation how even small shortages lead to misdistribution. And that is, of course, in a first world country like United Kingdom. So I think it is really important to think comparatively, but it's also really important to think in context.
Mm-hmm. Right. So to study societies in extremis, as you have put it, rather than to study a completely unique or an exclusively unique occurrence of famine, shortage, disease, and so forth. Yeah. So in your discussion about assimilation, you hinted this, but I'm curious if you would flesh it out a bit. Some scholars at least have observed that the condition of modernity implies a loss of belief in God, and therefore a loss of sense of transcendent meaning. Is it your sense that the very modern secularized internees at Theresienstadt felt this loss? Might the experience of what you call a mass society come to mitigate that, or to take the place of some more traditional structure of beliefs and behaviors? Anyway, so if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I need to come with a positional statement because it's quite important in discussion of religion. I thought a fair bit about religion in Theresienstadt, and my position is important here because I come from a very profoundly atheist background. So for me, discussion of religion in Theresienstadt is really a difficult one. Which is one of the reasons why I also did not include it in the book. Jana Leixening has written very beautifully, and I think also very courageously about the Catholic community in Theresienstadt. And I found it, and now I'm transitioning into intellectual answering the question rather than positioning myself, how actually the only truly transnational religious groups in Theresienstadt were the Christians. The Jewish groups were the Reform or Orthodox, pretty much all operated on a regional circle. So say the people from Plzeň would go to listen to the Pilsen rabbi. People from Prague would listen to the Prague rabbis. Sometimes they would go to, say, Leo Beck to check him out, just out of curiosity, but they didn't do that very much. Now, you also see how important religion is depending on people's habitus. If they were raised that religion is something important, then they would go every Friday evening or every Saturday to shul. That's what they continue doing to Theresienstadt. Czech Jews were, before 1918, the famous 4-day Jews. They would go to the shul on the 3 main holidays and on the birthday of the emperor, and after 1918 for 3 days. And they continue doing it in Theresienstadt. Imprisonment does not really impact the religious habits. But from the people that I know that in the testimonies mention any Jewish religious life, they do not necessarily continue doing it after liberation. And if they continue going to shul after liberation, it is mostly for social reasons. Historians like Vera Trnka and Martin Schmock and now Jakob Labens, who is finishing his book, look at the Jewish life in post-45 Czechoslovakia. And I will be very curious for them paying the attention, but I also wanted to make transparent my own position and my own blind spots. I'm kind of waiting for someone to come and challenge me and write a chapter on religion in Theresienstadt, but I'm also a bit maybe thinking there will be people who will do a better job and write a good analytical history of religious life in Theresienstadt that is not one that is descriptive and just celebratory, which has been done, but I think kind of misses the point as your question has shown.
Yeah, your observations lead me to another question about identity. In this case, what one might tentatively call ethnic identity. I think I mentioned to you earlier before this event that at the beginning of my career, I taught 2 Holocaust memoirs, one by a woman, a very secular Czech Jew, who was interned at Terezinstadt and then survived, somehow made it out of Auschwitz and a subsequent death march. And on the other hand, a German Jewish autobiography by the historian Peter Gay. And I, after all these years, I'm still struck by the bitterness of Peter Gay's, by the anger in Peter Gay's memoir, when he, a very, very genuinely Germanized Jew from a very genuinely Germanized family, didn't even go through a ghetto or camps. And on the other hand, we have the memoir of the Czech refugee who went through hell, and yet
Ruth Elias, right?
Sorry?
Ruth Elias, right?
Elias, right.
And Mengele killed her baby.
Yes, exactly. I mean, she's sort of a, paradigmatic of the worst of the experiences of the Shoah. So her narrative is comparatively sunny and bright, and I don't know because I'm not an expert by any means, but my sense is that her sense of embeddedness in an ethnic Jewish culture during the war, but especially before the war, may have contributed to her ability to get back on her feet and rebuild her life, not in Czechoslovakia, mind you, but in Israel. So I'm wondering if you find this evidence of this phenomena, these phenomena, I should say, of ethnic identification among people who, for example, as you pointed out, pay really no special attention to Tzom Gedalia, let's say, or the minor Jewish holidays, and are very interested in marking, Christmas. So is there something like that going on that may not be going on, let's say, in the histories of or in the history of German Jews? I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Ruth Elias is great because also Ruth Elias was actually briefly deported to the camp that I am writing about in the current book. And she has some really unbelievable stories that also touch on sexuality, but also women's agency and sexual violence that are really striking and funny, but also really, really eerie. And people like Judith Gerson and Alexandra Garbarini and Laura Jokush and David Engel have been working on narrativity and how the social setting in which we live dictates what we can recall, but also how we frame what we recall. And, you know, for example, Engel has been very outspoken in his criticism on the Polish edition of Celý Perichodník, this Jewish policeman from, I think, Otwocko, from Warsaw Ghetto. And that really applies when you come from a social setting of Czech Jews who has this very powerful framework of sentimentality, but also very powerful framework of irony. That's a very strong, almost a cause at how to make sense of things. When you afterwards emigrate, say, to the US, there's this arising in the 60s and 70s expectations of trauma. And if somebody constantly tells you must be traumatized, very probably your narrative will start showing that. We see it also in women's studies. Who starts talking about experience of sexual violence? It is women who survived the Holocaust, emigrated to the US, had some exposure to second wave feminism. And then indeed in the 1980s and 1990s, we have first careful voices that start speaking in first person about experiences of sexual violence. In the Czech Republic, it's only in the last years that Me Too came on the table and people who did not survive the Holocaust, people my generation, can speak about sexual violence. And this social setting really dictates a lot of different things. We know it when we meet people and have culture clashes, what people from Mexico or from Canada or from France talk about. So that is part of it, but the other part of it is the nature we have. My late grandfather, who survived the Holocaust, was a lovely man, also very taciturn and grumpy and angry and stingy. Would he have been stingy had he not survived the Holocaust? I strongly expect yes, but I'm a Holocaust historian who has studied all of these testimonies, and therefore I dare to think, even had he not spent 4 years walking around with Star of David, which, you know, doesn't really help your mental health, he would have been a troubled man. But we should be careful about the conclusions we draw. Ruth Elias would have been very possibly happy-go-lucky, but we also know, I because Czech Jews are all kind of know each other, she really struggled with depression. And therefore kind of these frameworks of narratability probably really shaped her memoir. I have not seen Lanzmann's Four Sisters, but I understand it's quite a different narrative she tells there.
Okay, interesting. I'd like to check that out. You know, I guess this goes to a point I've made in my own scholarship about people emplotting their own lives through the experience of retelling and not simply reflecting some facts that are outside of themselves. So I wanted to go back to the very title of your book, The Last Ghetto. Now, sometimes editors make choices for us, or at least they make very strong suggestions and we take them because they know business better, right? But tell me, what is this phrase? Why the last? The last in relation to what? What do you mean by that? Yeah.
My editor had a lot of strong choices, but not this one. I was desperately on the market for a good title that I wanted to have a good title. I did not want to have contributions on the observation of reflection of ABC. And Theresienstadt was the last ghetto to be liberated. It was liberated one day after the end of the war by the Red Army on 9th of May 1945. In fact, when I was growing up, Czechoslovakia celebrated the liberation by the Red Army on 9th of May. And I was, well, a teenager when I realized the end of war was actually one day earlier. So it was not Lodz that is often marked as the last ghetto. It was Theresienstadt. And, you know, the last ghetto is a kitschy title. It was literally the last ghetto. This is all.
Well, I mean, call it what you will. I don't think it's kitschy. I think it's very Oh,
Catchy.
catchy. Okay, yes, catchy, definitely catchy, not kitschy. Okay, very good. Just a technical question. You showed us very interesting visual material. I'm wondering whether this is material that more often than not you found among survivors, or is it archived somewhere? I mean, is there some generalization to be drawn about the types of, let's say, first-person narratives that you have found?
So I went to something like 100 archives in 3 continents and a number of languages. You find so much. Like, there is this expectation that diaries are incredibly precious. You find lots and lots of diaries. The bigger problem are they actually so interesting?
Mm-hmm.
Are they written in a script that you can read? I mean, I can read Zutelin, but not really well. And the question is, how much time are you going to spend on it, or in Kurent or in Schwabach? I can read Polish very slowly, but I cannot read Yiddish. And some of the testimonies of the people liberated in Theresienstadt at the end of the war are in Yiddish. So something like 90% of my book is based on various bulk of self-testimonies, diaries, letters, drawings, then early post-war testimonies, court proceedings where the survivors testified, but also the SS or the gendarmes. Then the oral histories from the early connections of the 1960s, because the Terezi Memorial started collecting oral histories in the 1960s. The oral history division of Hebrew University also started collecting in the 1960s. And then you have the classical 3 or 4 big oral history collections of Fortunov, Visual History Archive, aka Spielberg, and USHMM. I was fortunate enough to have met John Ringelheim, the founder of USHMM's Oral History Archive, the Czech collection at the Prague Jewish Museum. That is amazing. And then, of course, the published memoirs. I also looked at reparation files that people who emigrated from Czechoslovakia, not only people who lived in West Germany, have applied for. I looked at the applications victims of fascism that people who lived in East Germany could file. And I think this kind of covers the biggest basis of self-testimonies. But what we also have, and that is largely archived in Prague Jewish Museum and Yad Vashem, the documentation of the Jewish self-administration. That is contemporaneous, but it is not self-testimonies. And the problem with Theresienstadt collections, we do not have an obvious one archival collection where to go. It's been fragmented. Sometimes survivors took a little bit with them and you find it somewhere. And I found some of the so-called Poesie album, these friendship albums that people draw to each other, sometimes in people's papers. And I think there would be much more to find. But in a way, it's also the historian's call to say at some point, I have seen enough, and to move on. I could have included many more drawings, and if there were not thoughts of cost, I would have loved to include more. I have to say, the one thing where I fought with my editor, I would have loved to include pictures in color. And that was one battle that I lost. And I built a website, thelastghetto.org, where the images are in color. So if you want to check them out, and if you want to see the maps in higher resolution, you can have a look, and it's paid for the next 10 years. But I'm delighted that the Czech translation will come out with images in color, because it just does a much better job.
Listen, 2 things occurred to me. The first is that if you don't mind, we would like to have the link to the website that you've referred to. Normally, our department sends a note of thanks to the attendees, and I think very often this is a good way to get additional information to them. I may also list some of your publications that are not in, well, those in English, of course, but also those that are not in English, in case multilingual people wish to sample them. Before I break this open and let our audience chime in with questions and comments, I wanted to just ask a question that I had difficulty with as you were expositing, and that had to do with the Spring Shall Come poem. You were, I think, using it as an example of transnationality, and you said, if I remember correctly, that this poem would have been illegible to outsiders but for the transnationality of the outlook. I didn't quite understand that.
You're right. I made a mess of it.
No, I didn't
yeah.
say that.
So, you know, if you do not see the ghetto as a transnational place where these people communicate and create something new, you will think it's an oddity that an old Danish guy has a Czech poem that you will probably not even realize it's Czech and what it means. And only if you see the society in Theresienstadt that creates something new that is transnational by its nature, you will come to understand that he maybe did not speak Czech or spoke, 20 words, but this poem meant something to him and shows that especially hung out in circle of Czech friends. And this is because the poem was so important to them. This is why he kept it. So it's a signal that if you can read it, links to this making of the transnational society that is, because it was so short-lived, was quite ephemeral. But this missing the transnational nature of it, we will not understand really what was going on there.
I see. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Sorry, I was babbled before.
No, it's fine. I was trying to write notes and thinking of the time and so forth, so I didn't capture your underlying point. As I open the Q&A segment, let me just make a very sort of humble observation that to read the Yiddish records, archival records, might offer a very interesting view, or let's say a test of the assimilation thesis, because of course Yiddish speakers have I would imagine, have a rather different relationship with the surrounding culture than do speakers or monolingual Czech speakers or those who are bilingual in German and in Yiddish. Yiddish is 25% Hebrew, so the rest is really German. So once you get the alphabet down, I think you will have a very good time with that. Anyway, let me read a couple of comments and questions here. One attendee writes, you mentioned the phenomenon in which these mixed Jewish/Czech persons were often identified as attractive. Was this a form of racial fetishization, or is that too much of an anachronism to identify this as such?
Okay, so sorry, I came across as the wrong point that I wanted to make. The point that I wanted to make is that beauty in Theresienstadt reflects power hierarchies, and because the younger Czech Jews are in position of power, they are described by the German and Austrian and Dutch narrators as beautiful. And what they describe about them as beautiful is always coded as non-Jewish. So describe them, and this is also, I did not mention that, but the drawing by Lotra Borishova of this very Czech-coded and not particularly Jewish-looking woman with the naked leg is coded in many ways as quite athletic, but one could also say Slavic, even though her hair is dark, which is not something that is very Central European. And there's not necessarily something about mixedness, but there is definitely something about coding power in terms of aesthetic beauty, of being athletic, of being sportive, of being tall, of being red-cheeked, and of looking in non-Jewish ways. Sometimes people touch on the fact you can see that the Czech Jews are assimilated, but they do not talk about mixed marriages. Mixed marriages is a different point that I contributed to that.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. One attendee asks whether you would comment. I'm not sure I understand the request. Forgive me if I'm not getting this right, but would you comment about the elders and about, quote, the last of the unjust interviewed by Claude Lanzmann?
With delight. I wrote a whole essay about that I can post into the comment. I have many opinions about that. And I have to say I was very frustrated by the movie. I thought it was orientalizing. It was not critical. And it was, yes, I will post the essay. I will have to Google while I'm not talking. In German, there is this expression called Spätwerk, like late work. And in a way, if you are familiar with Lanzmann's oeuvre, and he was pretty hardcore, like he would corner these old Nazis who ran the railways and jump on them and do interviews. Like, he would never pass the ethics committee, not then and not today. And then he goes all soft on old Benjamin Murmelstein, and I would have also said he only started producing this work after he's seen historians like myself or Dorna Rabinovich, who said actually the interview with Murmelstein is super interesting and super important. And you also see here this kind of male bonding between two slightly corpulent alpha dogs who are kind of hanging with each other and have all of this kind of homosocial ability. So there are all of these layers in that, but it is a source. It is not an analysis. And maybe you can also say on a kind of personal note, my wife is French. And of course, France has a long imperial tradition. And even an outstanding critical feminist like my wife sometimes shows tendencies of kind of these unquestioned imperialist tendencies by looking at things and being extremely normative. And that is the feminist that is my partner. You see it in Lanzmann, how he comes to Bohušovice and shoots these scenes that looks at it as a completely desolate place. I have often traveled through France or United Kingdom or parts of US. You could make very similar shots there. And there is a bit of an responsibility of the ethics of what you show and what you kind of send the message of, look, I'm in complete backwater. I mean, people like Dorota Glowacka have shown that already for the Shoah and for certain kind of dismissal of Poland as kind of the colonial backwater. And because with great power comes great responsibility, I think we need to be able to say that about Lanzmann, especially for shooting a movie like that. I think he released it in 2013, 2014, and it's definitively in there. But I think when I wrote that essay in 2014, I have said kind of everything about it. And now that you ask me, I speak from memory because I felt I have said everything, all that I liked, all that annoyed me, all my analysis. Check out the essay. I will Google it right now while Professor Grace Ward is speaking.
Yeah, well, I don't have much to say. I wanted to, while I wait for other contributions from the audience, I wanted to ask you, just for the sake of people who are, unlike us, not ensconced in academia, whether you would briefly define the terms orientalizing and habitus. Now, I'm not suggesting that you've been unclear. I think people can probably guess from the context of your use of the terms what you mean. But perhaps you wish to add another layer of significance so that people don't think we're just fetishizing language here.
Yes, and I also feel very accomplished because I listened to you and I found the link. I will post it in Q&A.
Great. Okay.
Hosts and panelists, no, everyone here. Because it came out on Estonian Politik, and a lot of French academic websites are ungoogleable, which is sad. Habitus, I tried to, because I know it is very academic, I tried to very briefly define it. And my quick take would be, it's a social fabric that informs us how we take within the group or social circles that we come from. It expresses commonality in taste. It expresses commonality of expressing humor, what we find funny, how we are funny, what we laugh to, and how we will laugh. Like, in fact, even how we laugh and what noises we make and what gestures we make are influenced by our habitus, how we understand gender, how we understand beauty, how we express sex appeal, how we will flirt with someone or hit on someone, how we will make sense of sexual violence, how we show solidarity, how we make friends, and how we spend time with friends, whether we will drink red wine, how much we will spend on red wine. Are we going to drink our beer cold? Are we going to have dinner at 6 o'clock or at 8 o'clock? Or in England, very important, are we going to call it supper, dinner, or tea? So in England, this is a whole thing about habitus. I could say more, but in a way, it is what makes us human and the people with whom we hang out. That can be ethnic, that can be class, that can be generational, that can be about social, sexual orientation, and all of these things together do habitus. In my example, I'm your classical caviar gauche. I'm the person who goes to Waitrose and stands at the cheese counter and spends too much time on it. And I go on my social media and post some wannabe Vogue comments. That's my habitus. I'm aware of that. But I also see it for the bubble in which I live and the things that kind of are the threadbare of it. And that's, I think, kind of also the responsibility of social scientists and humanities scholars. Orientalism and orientalizing is the notion not only of seeing people as others, but ascribing them to values that are in binary opposition to us. So whereas the West is the reasonable, is the masculine, is the sportive, and is cold, people who have this kind of orientalized group are coded as feminine, they are driven by passion, they look racially coded, their skin is olive-skinned, their eyes are sparkling, they are cunning, they are unreliable. So, and all of this goes back, I mean, among others, but best known is the Palestinian-born American scholar Edward Said, who published, I think, in 1978, his book Orientalism, that has this really important merit of theoretizing Orientalism for what it does and showing that it's a human tendency, but not a fact.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So with that, let's say that the comment on theory, I think we can think about adjourning. Actually, one question came in, so we'll, if you don't mind, I'll pose it, and then you can answer as briefly or as with as much time as you wish. Why were so many non-Jews sent to the ghetto to create this transnational society you describe, and how many survived relative to the Jewish emanates?
Yeah, thank you so much. I do want to say, I have just managed to define Orientalism at midnight my time. I think that needs to be appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely.
I am really sorry if I gave the impression that any Gentiles were deported to Theresienstadt. Everybody who was deported to Theresienstadt were racially Jewish. Some of these people did not consider themselves as Jewish. They identity as Czechs or atheists or Christians was much more important to them. The Nazis did not aim to create a transnational ghetto. Their aim was to create a transit ghetto that would hold people that also had the goal of pretend to be at an advantageous position where the elderly from Greater Germany would be held, or people with multiple nationalities, or a place where Jews could be exchanged for people held by the Allies, and so on. And eventually it also became a place that could be used for propaganda, or at least this is what the Nazis believed. But the Nazis did not aim to create a transnational community. They were not interested in the experiences of the prisoners at all. And therefore they were not interested in the culture or in the soccer games or in the lives of the children, because for them, these people were already dead and they did not even see them as people. So when we know that, for example, some of the SS would be using the Jewish eye doctors, the ophthalmologists, to fix their eyesight, or if they if their lovers became pregnant and they needed an abortion, which was of course illegal in Nazi Germany, they would use the Jewish gynecologists. But because they saw them, very similarly to American history of enslaved people, somebody who is skilled but is not your fellow human and anyways is about to be murdered, but you can still make use of their abilities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we are unfortunately out of time, but I want to thank you once again, Professor Hájková, for a very interesting slice, very sobering slice of social and cultural history. Let me share that one of the reasons that I invited you, of all people, is that I'm very concerned that the history of the Shoah, Holocaust, the Qurban, whatever you wish to call it, is very often told, for example, in the main exhibit of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, as the history of the machinery of destruction, the Nazis, what they did, and so forth. And of course, preserving those broad outlines of the story is very important to understand the mentality, let's say the conducive conditions for hysteria and anti-Semitism. This is very important to document. But I, as a historian of the Jews, I'm very conscious that there's also the need to focus precisely on the habitus, right? The ordinary lives of Jews, the culture or cultures, the Jewish cultures that were lost in the Shoah. So with that, I want to thank you again, and thank you to the members of the audience. We will be sending you a brief note with some resources, including the ones that have just been shared by Professor Hájková. So thank you very much, Anna. I look forward to seeing you again. And thank you all. We'll see you on February the 8th for Isabella Tabarovsky's talk on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.